The scream that shattered the winter morning came from a woman stumbling through snowdrifts 3 miles outside Concord, Montana. Her dress torn, and her face streaked with tears that had frozen against her cheeks. January 1884 had brought the worst winter storms the territory had seen in a decade, and Julia Thompson had been walking since dawn, her thin boots leaving bloody prints in the snow behind her. She had nowhere else to go. The small boarding house where she'd been staying had burned down 2 nights ago, taking everything she owned with it, and the few coins she'd had hidden in her hem had been stolen while she slept in the town's livery stable. The owner had discovered her that morning and told her in no uncertain terms that she needed to leave before he called the sheriff. She had no family, no friends in this harsh land, and winter showed no signs of loosening its grip. Julia had come west 6 months ago after her father died back in Philadelphia, leaving her with nothing but debts and the memory of his drunken rages. She'd thought Montana would offer a fresh start, a chance to work as a seamstress or perhaps a schoolteacher. But Concord was a rough mining town that had little use for educated women from the East, and the few jobs available had already been claimed. The wind cut through her thin wool coat like knives, and Julia's legs trembled with exhaustion. She could barely feel her fingers anymore. In the distance, she spotted a ranch house with smoke rising from its chimney, and desperation drove her forward. She had to ask for help, even though the thought of begging terrified her. Pride had sustained her through so much, but pride wouldn't keep her alive in this frozen wasteland. The ranch was larger than she'd initially thought, with a sturdy barn and several outbuildings that spoke of prosperity. Cattle huddled together in a snow-covered pasture, their breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. Julia's heart pounded as she approached the main house, her shame burning hot despite the cold. She'd never asked anyone for charity in her life, and the thought of doing so now made her stomach twist. She stood on the porch for a long moment, gathering her courage. Her whole body shook, partly from cold and partly from fear. What if they turned her away? What if they called her a vagrant and had her arrested? What if they demanded something in return that she couldn't give? The stories she'd heard about what happened to desperate women in frontier towns echoed in her mind. Before she could knock, the door swung open, and a man stood in the doorway. He was tall, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore simple ranch clothes, denim pants and a wool shirt with the sleeves rolled up despite the cold, revealing strong forearms marked with old scars. His face was weathered from years working outdoors, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. He looked surprised to see her, then concerned as he took in her condition. "Madam." His voice was deep and careful, as though he was afraid of startling her. "Are you all right?" Julia tried to speak, but her teeth were chattering too hard. She wrapped her arms around herself, aware of how she must look, ragged and half-frozen, standing uninvited on a stranger's porch. The words she'd rehearsed fled her mind, leaving only raw need. "I'm sorry," she finally managed. "I didn't know where else to go. The boarding house burned, and I have nowhere to stay, and I thought perhaps you might need help with cooking or cleaning or anything at all. I can work very hard, I promise. I won't be any trouble." The man's expression shifted to something she couldn't quite read. He studied her for a long moment, and Julia felt her heart sink. He was going to refuse. Of course he was. Why would a stranger take in a homeless woman? She started to turn away, humiliation burning through her. "Please," she whispered, hating how broken she sounded. "I'm a good person. I just need a chance." She stood shaking in the snow, unsure if he'd accept her. The cowboy smiled and said, "You're perfect." Julia stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What?" I said come inside before you freeze to death. He stepped back, holding the door open wider. My housekeeper left 2 weeks ago to care for her sick mother in Helena. I've been managing on my own, but the place is a disaster, and I can't cook worth a damn. If you're willing to work for room and board plus wages, the job is yours. She hesitated, searching his face for any sign of deception or ulterior motives. But his eyes were steady and kind, and the warmth spilling out from the house was too tempting to resist. She stepped inside, and he closed the door behind her, shutting out the bitter wind. The interior was indeed chaotic. Dirty dishes were piled in the kitchen, clothes were strewn across chairs, and dust covered most surfaces. But it was warm, blessedly warm, and Julia felt her frozen limbs begin to tingle painfully as blood flow returned. "I'm Samuel Reed," the man said, extending his hand. "This is the running our ranch. It's been in my family for 15 years. Julia took his hand, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work. "Julia Thompson. Thank you, Mr. Reed. You don't know what this means to me. Call me Samuel." He studied her with those perceptive gray eyes. "When did you last eat?" She tried to remember. Yesterday morning, perhaps. A stale biscuit she'd found discarded behind the bakery. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." He guided her to a chair near the fireplace. "Sit down. I'll make some coffee and heat up some stew." As he moved around the kitchen with surprising efficiency for someone who claimed he couldn't cook, Julia felt tears prick her eyes. She'd been so certain that she would die out there in the snow, that Montana would claim her just as it had claimed so many others who'd come west seeking better lives. The sudden reversal of fortune felt like a miracle. Samuel brought her a bowl of beef stew and a thick slice of bread. The food was simple but hot, and Julia had to force herself to eat slowly instead of gulping it down like an animal. He sat across from her with his own bowl, giving her space but watching to make sure she was all right. "The housekeeper's room is off the kitchen," he said after a while. "It has a good stove and plenty of blankets. You can settle in there. As for wages, I can pay $30 a month plus room and board. That's what I was paying Mrs. Chen." $30 was more than fair, especially with room and board included. Julia nodded, not trusting herself to speak without crying. "There's one rule," Samuel continued, his voice firm but not unkind. "This is a respectable household. I won't have anyone saying otherwise. Your room has a lock on the inside and you're to use it every night. If you ever feel unsafe or uncomfortable, you tell me immediately." "Understood." Julia met his eyes and saw only sincerity there. "Yes, sir, Samuel," he corrected gently. "We'll be living under the same roof and working together. Might as well use first names." After she finished eating, Samuel showed her to the housekeeper's room. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window that looked out over the ranch. Someone, probably Mrs. Chen, had hung cheerful yellow curtains that brightened the space. A pot-bellied stove sat in the corner, already stacked with wood. "There are some of Mrs. Chen's old dresses in the wardrobe," Samuel said. "She said I could give them away if anyone needed them. You're about the same size, I think. Help yourself to anything useful." Julia's throat tightened. "Thank you." He nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "Julia, welcome home." After he left, Julia locked the door and sank onto the bed. She buried her face in her hands and allowed herself to cry, great shuddering sobs of relief and exhaustion. She'd been so scared, so utterly terrified, and now she was safe. It seemed impossible. When the tears finally stopped, she explored the wardrobe and found 4 practical work dresses, 2 nightgowns, a heavy coat, and a pair of sturdy boots that fit reasonably well. Mrs. Chen had been a generous woman to leave these behind. Julia carefully removed her torn, filthy dress and washed as best she could with the basin of water on the dresser. Then she put on one of the clean dresses, a simple brown calico that was warm and comfortable. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the dresser. Her blonde hair was tangled and dirty, her face too thin, her blue eyes shadowed with fatigue. But she was alive, and she had a chance to start over. That would have to be enough. The next morning, Julia woke before dawn, her years of early rising automatic even in her exhaustion. She stoked the fire in her stove, dressed quickly in the cold room, and ventured into the main house. Samuel wasn't up yet, so she quietly began assessing the work that needed doing. The kitchen was her first priority. She heated water on the stove, washed the accumulated dishes, and scrubbed the counters and table until they gleamed. She found potatoes and onions in the root cellar, bacon in the cold storage, and eggs from the henhouse out back. By the time Samuel emerged from his bedroom, she had breakfast ready and hot coffee brewing. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen, staring at the transformation. "You didn't have to start today. You should rest." "I'm fine," Julia said, and this time it was true. A good night's sleep in a warm bed had worked wonders. "I want to earn my keep." They ate together in comfortable silence. Samuel was clearly not a morning talker, which suited Julia fine. She'd grown up in a house where breakfast was accompanied by her father's complaints and demands, and the peaceful quiet was a blessing. After breakfast, Samuel headed out to tend the cattle and horses while Julia tackled the rest of the house. She swept and mopped the floors, beat the dust from the curtains and rugs, organized the scattered belongings, and made lists of supplies that needed replenishing. The work was hard but satisfying, each completed task a small victory. Samuel came in for lunch, stamping snow from his boots. "The place looks amazing." I'd forgotten what clean floors looked like. Julia felt a small glow of pride. "Thank you. I found your sewing supplies. The curtains in the sitting room need mending if that's all right." "Whatever you think best." He paused. "Mrs. Chen used to go into town on Saturdays for supplies. The wagon is yours to use whenever you need it." Over the following weeks, they settled into a comfortable routine. Julia managed the household while Samuel ran the ranch. They took meals together, gradually growing more comfortable with each other. Samuel proved to be a man of few words but deep kindness. He never made her feel like a servant, always treating her with respect and courtesy. Julia learned that he'd inherited the ranch from his father, who died 3 years ago. His mother had passed when he was young, and he had no siblings. He'd been engaged once, to a woman from town, but she'd broken it off when she realized how isolated ranch life was. She wanted parties and social calls and all the things you find in a city, Samuel explained one evening as they sat by the fire after dinner. "I couldn't give her that. This ranch is my life." "It's a good life," Julia said softly. "Honest work, beautiful land." He looked at her with something like wonder. "Not many people see it that way. Most women can't wait to leave." Julia thought about that later, alone in her room. She'd been at the ranch for nearly a month now, and she couldn't imagine wanting to leave. The isolation that would have bothered her 6 months ago now felt like peace. The hard work that might have seemed burdensome was actually fulfilling. And Samuel himself had become a friend, someone she looked forward to seeing each day. That realization troubled her. She was his employee, nothing more. It would be foolish and dangerous to develop feelings for him. He'd saved her life and given her honest work, but that didn't mean he saw her as anything other than his housekeeper. The last thing she wanted was to make things awkward by misreading his kindness. But it was hard not to notice things about him. The way his face softened when he talked about the cattle he was raising. How he always made sure she had enough firewood before a storm. the laugh lines around his eyes that appeared when something genuinely amused him, which was more often than he probably realized. The careful way he moved around the house, as though he was always conscious of her presence and didn't want to startle her. February arrived with more snow. One afternoon, Julia was in the barn gathering eggs when a gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her. She tried to open it, but something had jammed. She pushed harder, starting to panic. The barn was warm enough with the animals, but being trapped anywhere made her think of her father locking her in the root cellar as punishment. "Julia," Samuel's voice came from outside. The wind blew a branch against the door. "Hold on." A moment later, the door swung open. Samuel stood there, the offending branch in his hand, concern written across his face. "Are you all right?" Julia realized she was shaking. "Yes, sorry, I just don't like being locked in." He studied her for a moment, and she had the feeling he understood more than she'd said. "Come on. Let's get you inside. It's getting cold." That evening, Samuel seemed quieter than usual. After they finished dinner and Julia started washing dishes, he cleared his throat. "I need to tell you something," he said. "There's a dance in town next Saturday. The winter social, they call it. I have to go because I'm on the Ranchers Association board, and they expect me to make an appearance. I was wondering if you'd like to come with me." Julia's heart did an odd little jump. "As your housekeeper." "As my friend," Samuel corrected. "You've been here 6 weeks and you haven't left the ranch once. I thought you might enjoy getting out, seeing people, having some fun." She wanted to say yes immediately, but caution held her back. "People in town don't know me. They might wonder who I am, why I'm working for you." "Let them wonder." His jaw set in a stubborn line she'd come to recognize. "You have nothing to be ashamed of. You're a good woman who fell on hard times. Anyone who judges you for that isn't worth knowing." Julia felt warmth spread through her chest. "Then yes, I'd like to go. Thank you." The next few days were a flutter of preparation. Julia had nothing suitable to wear to a dance. The work dresses Mrs. Chen had left were practical but plain. Samuel solved the problem by driving her into Concord on Thursday, something he claimed he needed to do anyway for supplies. The town was bigger than Julia remembered from her desperate wandering. The main street had a mercantile, a bank, a hotel, 2 saloons, a church, and various other businesses. Samuel led her to a dress shop run by a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Patterson. "Miss Thompson needs a dress for the winter social," Samuel said. "Something nice but practical that she can wear to church too." Mrs. Patterson looked Julia up and down with sharp eyes. "You're Samuel Reed's new housekeeper. I heard he'd found someone." "Yes, madam," Julia said, lifting her chin. She could feel the judgment in the woman's gaze, but Samuel stepped forward. "Julia is a friend who's helping me manage the ranch house. She's a respectable woman from Philadelphia, and I expect her to be treated with courtesy." Something in his tone made Mrs. Patterson's expression shift. "Of course, Mr. Reed. Let's see what we have." They settled on a deep blue wool dress with a modest neckline and a slightly fuller skirt than Julia's work dresses. It was the nicest thing Julia had owned in years. Samuel paid without hesitation, over Julia's protests that she could use her wages. "Consider it a bonus for putting up with my terrible cooking that first week," he said. As they loaded supplies into the wagon, Julia noticed people watching them. Some looked curious, others disapproving. She wondered what rumors were circulating about Samuel Reed and his mysterious housekeeper. Samuel must have noticed her discomfort. Small towns are all the same. They gossip because they have nothing better to do. Give them a few months and they'll find something else to talk about. Saturday arrived clear and cold. Julia spent extra time on her appearance, braiding her hair in a crown around her head and pinching her cheeks for color. The blue dress fit perfectly, and she allowed herself a moment of vanity, pleased with how she looked. Samuel's expression when she emerged from her room was gratifying. "You look beautiful." The compliment made her blush. "Thank you, you look very handsome yourself." He did too. He'd put on a clean white shirt, a dark vest, and his best pants. He'd even trimmed his hair and shaved carefully. They looked like a proper couple heading to a social event, and Julia had to remind herself that this was just two friends going to a dance. The ride into town was pleasant despite the cold. Samuel had heated bricks wrapped in cloth for their feet, and Julia was warm beneath a heavy blanket. They talked about ordinary things, the weather, the cattle, plans for spring planting. But Julia was acutely aware of Samuel beside her, the solid warmth of him, the way his hands handled the reins with easy confidence. The dance was being held in the town hall, a large building that also served as a school and meeting place. Music spilled out into the cold night, fiddle and piano playing a lively tune. Samuel helped Julia down from the wagon, his hands steady on her waist. Inside, the hall was crowded with ranchers, miners, merchants, and their families. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm light over the dancing couples. A table along one wall held food brought by the various attendees, and another table served as a bar. Several men called greetings to Samuel, and he responded with easy familiarity. But Julia noticed the women watching her with undisguised curiosity. She felt suddenly self-conscious, aware that she was an outsider in a close-knit community. An older woman approached, her expression friendly. "Samuel Reed, you stop hiding this young lady and introduce us properly." Samuel relaxed slightly. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Miss Julia Thompson. She's managing my household. Julia, Mrs. Henderson is the postmaster's wife and the best baker in the county. Don't you flatter me, Mrs. Henderson said, but she smiled. She turned to Julia with kind eyes. "Welcome to Concord, dear. I heard about the boarding house fire, terrible tragedy. I'm glad you found a safe place with Samuel here. His family has always been good people." The warmth in her voice made Julia's throat tight. "Thank you, madam. That means a great deal." Other introductions followed. Most people were polite if reserved. Julia understood. She was a stranger, and frontier communities were often cautious with newcomers. She would have to earn their trust over time. When the band struck up a waltz, Samuel turned to her. "Would you like to dance?" Julia's heart skipped. "I'm not sure I remember how. It's been years." "I'll remind you." He offered his hand, and she took it. On the dance floor, Samuel placed one hand on her waist and held her other hand in his. The touch sent electricity through Julia's body. They began to move, and after a few awkward steps, Julia found the rhythm. Samuel was a better dancer than she'd expected, guiding her smoothly through the turns. "You're full of surprises," she said. "Where did a rancher learn to waltz?" "My mother taught me before she died. She said a gentleman should know how to dance." His eyes were warm. "I'm glad she did, or I'd be stepping all over your feet right now." They danced 3 more dances, and Julia felt like she was floating. Being in Samuel's arms, moving together to the music, felt more right than anything had in her entire life. She caught herself imagining what it would be like if this were real, if they were truly courting instead of just employer and employee. But reality intruded when Samuel was called away to discuss ranch business with other members of the association. Julia found herself standing alone near the refreshment table, suddenly vulnerable. 2 women approached, both younger than Julia, dressed in expensive gowns that marked them as daughters of prosperous families. The taller one, a brunette with cold eyes, spoke first. "So you're Samuel Reed's new housekeeper. How interesting." There was something unpleasant in her tone. Julia straightened her spine. "Yes, I'm very grateful for the position." The other woman, a redhead with a pinched expression, looked Julia up and down. "I'm sure you are. Living alone with a man on an isolated ranch, how convenient. Julia felt heat rise in her face. It's a perfectly respectable arrangement. Mr. Reed has been nothing but a gentleman. Of course he has, the brunette said with false sweetness. Margaret here was engaged to Samuel 2 years ago. They would have been married by now if she hadn't realized what kind of life he was offering. Stuck on a ranch miles from town, with no society, no culture, no proper company. Margaret, the redhead, lifted her chin. I made the right choice. Samuel needs someone who doesn't mind being buried in the middle of nowhere, doing backbreaking work, never seeing another soul. I suppose a woman with no other options might find that appealing. The words were designed to wound, and they did, but Julia refused to let these women see her hurt. I find honest work and quiet living very appealing, actually. Not everyone needs constant entertainment to be happy. How noble, the brunette said. But don't think just because you're living in his house and batting your eyes at him that Samuel will marry you. He's not interested in charity cases. Catherine, Margaret. Samuel's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He'd appeared behind Julia, his expression colder than she'd ever seen it. I believe you ladies should rejoin your families. Catherine had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, but Margaret met his gaze defiantly. We were just getting acquainted with your housekeeper. No, you were being rude to a woman who has done nothing to deserve it. Samuel's voice was quiet but hard as iron. Julia is my friend and a valued member of my household. Anyone who disrespects her disrespects me. I trust that's clear. Margaret's face flushed red. You've changed, Samuel. You used to have ambition, wanted more than just that ranch. I've always known what I wanted. You're the one who changed. He turned to Julia, his expression softening. Are you all right? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Samuel offered his arm and they walked away from the two women, leaving them standing by the refreshment table. Once they were on the other side of the room, Julia found her voice. You didn't have to do that. I can handle mean comments. I know you can, but you shouldn't have to. He looked troubled. Margaret was my fiancée, like they said. She ended things because she couldn't stand ranch life. I thought I'd understood, but the way she just spoke to you makes me wonder if I ever really knew her at all. People can be cruel when they feel threatened, Julia said softly. Threatened? By what? Julia realized what she'd said. I don't know. Maybe they thought I was overstepping my place. Samuel stopped walking and turned to face her fully. The noise of the dance faded around them. Julia, I need to tell you something. These past 6 weeks have been the happiest I've had in years. It's not just that the house is clean or that your cooking is wonderful. It's you. Coming in from work and knowing you'll be there. Talking with you over dinner. Hearing you hum while you sew. I look forward to every moment. Julia's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Samuel, I'm your employee. You're my friend, and I think maybe you could be more if you wanted. His gray eyes searched her face. I know I'm not offering much, just a ranch and a simple life. But I promise you'd be cherished, protected, respected. I'd do everything in my power to make you happy. Are you asking what I think you're asking? Julia whispered. I'm asking if you'd consider courting with me, properly, so everyone knows my intentions are honorable. I'm asking if maybe someday you might want to stay at the Running R Ranch not as my housekeeper but as my wife. Julia felt tears prick her eyes. Samuel, you barely know me. I could be anyone, could have done anything. I know who you are. I've seen your kindness, your strength, your integrity. I've watched you work yourself to exhaustion to earn your keep, even though you didn't have to prove anything. I've seen how gentle you are with the animals, how you leave food for the winter birds, how you mended my father's old quilt even though I never asked. I know everything I need to know. I was so scared when I came to your door, Julia said, the words tumbling out. I thought I might die in the snow. And then you opened that door and you were so kind. And every day since then, I've been trying so hard not to fall in love with you because I was sure it was impossible, that you'd never see me as anything but a charity case. You were never a charity case. Samuel's voice was fierce. You were a blessing, the best thing that ever happened to me. When you stood on my porch that day, shaking and scared and still so proud, I thought you were the bravest person I'd ever seen. You said I was perfect, Julia remembered. I thought I'd misheard. You didn't mishear, I meant it. He took her hands in his. Julia Thompson, would you do me the honor of courting me? No pressure, no expectations. Just a chance for us to see if this could work. Julia looked up at this man who had saved her life and then, without meaning to, captured her heart. Yes. Yes, I would very much like that. The smile that broke across Samuel's face was radiant. He squeezed her hands and Julia squeezed back. They stood there in the middle of the crowded dance hall, grinning at each other like fools, and Julia didn't care who was watching. Mrs. Henderson appeared beside them, beaming. Well, it's about time. I told my husband the moment I saw you two together that there was something special there. Samuel Reed, you ask this young lady to dance properly now that you've made your intentions clear. Samuel laughed and led Julia back to the dance floor. As they waltzed, Julia felt like she was in a dream. Everything had changed so fast. Just this morning she'd been his housekeeper. Now she was courting him, with the possibility of becoming his wife. It was almost too much to take in. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of happiness. They danced, ate, and talked with other attendees. Word spread quickly about Samuel and Julia's courtship, and Julia noticed the change in how people treated her. She was no longer just the mysterious housekeeper, but Samuel Reed's intended, which apparently made all the difference. As they drove home under a sky full of stars, Julia leaned against Samuel's shoulder. Thank you for tonight, for everything. Thank you for saying yes. He kissed the top of her head, a gentle gesture that made Julia's heart sing. I'll court you properly, Julia. We'll take our time, do this right. But taking their time proved difficult when they were living in the same house and falling more in love every day. Samuel was attentive and romantic in ways Julia had never imagined. He picked wildflowers for her when the first spring blooms appeared. He taught her to ride horses so they could explore the ranch together. He read to her in the evenings from his small collection of books. Julia continued managing the household, but now the work felt different. She was no longer just earning her keep, but building a home with the man she loved. She planted a vegetable garden and planned where she would put flower beds. She reorganized the kitchen to be more efficient and made new curtains for the windows. Every improvement was an investment in their shared future. In late March, Samuel took her on a picnic to a high meadow on the ranch where wildflowers were just beginning to bloom. They spread a blanket and ate the lunch Julia had packed, enjoying the warmth of the spring sunshine. My father proposed to my mother in this meadow, Samuel said. He always said it was the most beautiful spot in Montana. Julia looked around at the rolling hills, the distant mountains still capped with snow, the endless sky. He was right. Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Julia's breath caught. He opened it to reveal a simple gold ring with a small diamond. This was my mother's. My father gave it to me before he died and told me to give it to the woman I wanted to spend my life with. Samuel took Julia's hand. Julia Thompson, I know we've only been courting for 2 months, but I've never been more certain of anything. Will you marry me? Julia's eyes filled with tears. Yes, yes, Samuel, I'll marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly as though it had been made for her. Then he kissed her soft and sweet, and Julia felt like she was finally, truly home. They were married in late April in Concord's small church. Mrs. Henderson helped Julia make a simple white dress, and several ranch families attended the ceremony. It wasn't the grand wedding Julia's mother had probably imagined for her daughter back in Philadelphia, but it was perfect in its simplicity and sincerity. Samuel's vows were straightforward and heartfelt. "I promise to love you, protect you, and cherish you for all my days. I promise to build a life with you that honors both of us. I promise to be faithful, honest, and true." Julia's voice shook with emotion as she made her own vows. "I promise to stand beside you in good times and bad. I promise to be your partner, your friend, and your love. I promise to make our house a home and to fill our lives with joy." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed her with such tenderness that Julia felt tears slip down her cheeks. They were happy tears, she realized. For the first time in her life, she was crying from pure joy. The wedding breakfast at the hotel was simple but festive. The ranching community had embraced Julia fully now that she was one of them, and she received many warm wishes and practical gifts: quilts, preserves, seeds for her garden, even a laying hen from Mrs. Henderson. As they drove back to the ranch, now officially theirs together, Samuel kept glancing at her with a look of wonder. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and this will all be a dream." "If it's a dream, I don't want to wake up," Julia said. That night, in the bedroom that was now theirs to share, Samuel was patient and gentle. He'd carried her over the threshold of their home, making her laugh with the old-fashioned gesture, but his smile had faded to something more serious as he set her down. "I want you to be happy," he said quietly. "If you're ever not, you tell me and we'll fix it together." Julia cupped his face in her hands. "I'm happy right now, happier than I ever thought possible." They came together with tenderness and growing passion, learning each other's bodies, discovering what brought pleasure and joy. Julia had been nervous, knowing only vague things about what happened between husbands and wives, but Samuel's patience and care made everything natural and right. Afterward, lying in his arms, she felt completely safe and cherished. The spring and summer passed in a haze of contentment. Julia threw herself into making the ranch house a real home. She painted the kitchen a cheerful yellow, planted roses by the front porch, and organized the cluttered storage rooms. Samuel built her a larger chicken coop and enclosed space for a bigger garden. They worked side by side, partners in every sense of the word. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the mountains, Samuel's arm around Julia's shoulders, planning their future. They talked about expanding the cattle herd, about building a larger barn, about all the things they would do together. In late August, Julia realized she hadn't had her monthly courses in some time. She'd been feeling tired and slightly queasy in the mornings, but she'd attributed it to working too hard in the summer heat. When she finally allowed herself to consider the possibility, her heart began to race. She waited until she was certain, then told Samuel one evening after dinner. He was examining some ranch records at the table and Julia stood behind him, her hands on his shoulders. "Samuel, I have something to tell you." He turned in his chair, immediately attentive. "What is it?" "Are you all right?" "I'm wonderful." Julia smiled, feeling joy bubble up inside her. "I'm going to have a baby." Samuel's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, disbelief, then pure radiant joy. He stood so quickly his chair nearly fell over and he pulled Julia into his arms. "A baby, are you sure?" "As sure as I can be. I think it will be born in early spring." Samuel held her at arm's length, looking her over as though checking for changes. "How do you feel? Are you well? Should you be doing less? We need to get you to the doctor." Julia laughed at his sudden protectiveness. "I feel fine. A little tired, but that's normal." Mrs. Henderson told me she's helped deliver dozens of babies and she'll make sure I have everything I need. Over the following months, Samuel was hilariously overprotective. He insisted Julia rest more, tried to take over the housework, and worried constantly. Julia found it both endearing and exasperating. She was pregnant, not an invalid. But she also loved seeing this side of him, the fierce protectiveness that came from deep love. He built a cradle in the evenings, sanding it until it was perfectly smooth. Julia sewed tiny gowns and blankets, marveling at how small the clothes were. Winter came again, almost exactly a year after Julia had arrived at the ranch. One evening, as snow fell outside, Julia sat by the fire with her hand on her swollen belly. Samuel was beside her, his hand covering hers, feeling the baby kick. "I was thinking," Julia said softly, "about what might have happened if I hadn't knocked on your door that day, if I'd kept walking, or if you'd turned me away." Samuel's arm tightened around her. "Don't think about that. I have to sometimes, because it helps me appreciate this. I was so lost, Samuel, so scared and alone. And you saved me." "We saved each other," Samuel corrected. "I was lonely before you came. I didn't even realize how lonely until you were here and I understood what I'd been missing. You brought light into my life, Julia. You made this house a home and gave me a reason to build something lasting." Their son was born in early March during a late winter storm. The labor was long and difficult, and Samuel paced the kitchen while Mrs. Henderson and the doctor attended Julia in their bedroom. When he finally heard the baby's cry, he rushed in to find Julia exhausted but smiling, holding a red-faced, squalling infant. "A boy," Mrs. Henderson announced proudly. "Healthy lungs, good size. You did well, Julia." Samuel knelt beside the bed, tears streaming down his face. "He's perfect." "You're perfect. I can't believe this is real." They named him Thomas Samuel Reed, after Samuel's father. Baby Thomas had his mother's blonde hair and his father's gray eyes, and he quickly became the center of their world. Samuel proved to be a devoted father, walking Thomas around the house at night when he fussed, singing off-key lullabies, staring at his son with endless wonder. Julia watched her husband with their child and felt her heart might burst with happiness. This life they'd built together, this family they'd created, was everything she'd ever wanted without knowing she wanted it. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Samuel expanded the herd and improved the breeding stock. Julia's garden provided more vegetables than they could use, so she started selling preserves and pickles in town. They were building something solid, something that would last. When Thomas was 2, Julia became pregnant again. This time, she recognized the signs immediately and wasn't surprised when she felt the familiar queasiness. The pregnancy was easier than the first, and in late fall, she delivered a healthy baby girl they named Margaret Ann, after Samuel's mother. Margaret had her father's dark hair and her mother's blue eyes, and she was a calm, content baby who rarely fussed. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything. Julia often found Samuel sitting with both children, Thomas on one knee and Margaret cradled in his arm, reading them stories or just talking to them about the ranch. The years flowed past like water. Thomas grew strong and helpful, following his father around the ranch, learning everything Samuel could teach him. Margaret was quieter but observant, often sitting with Julia as she worked, asking endless questions about everything. When Thomas was 6 and Margaret was 4, Julia discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was unexpected as she'd thought their family was complete, but Samuel was delighted. "Another blessing," he said, kissing her soundly. "We have plenty of room, plenty of love." The third baby, another boy they named James William, was born on a beautiful spring morning. He came quickly, almost catching Mrs. Henderson by surprise, and emerged squalling his displeasure at the world. Unlike his calm sister, James was demanding and energetic from the start. "This one is going to keep us on our toes," Mrs. Henderson predicted, and she was right. As the children grew, the ranch house was always full of noise and laughter. Thomas was responsible and serious, already showing signs of becoming a fine rancher like his father. Margaret was gentle and artistic, spending hours drawing pictures of the animals and landscape. James was the wild one, always climbing things he shouldn't, befriending every stray animal, keeping his parents constantly worried. Julia sometimes stood on the porch, watching her children play in the yard while Samuel worked with the horses nearby, and marveled at how much her life had changed. She thought about that desperate woman who'd stood shaking in the snow, certain she was going to die, and felt profound gratitude for every moment since. One evening, when the children were finally in bed after much protesting, Samuel and Julia sat on the porch as they had so many times before. Julia was 40 now, with silver threading through her blonde hair, and Samuel was nearing 45, his hair more gray than dark. But the love between them had only deepened with time. "You ever regret it?" Julia asked. "Taking in a stranger that day?" "You could have had an easier life with someone else." Samuel pulled her close. "Easier maybe, but not better, never better. You were exactly what I needed, Julia. You still are. I love you," she said simply. "I don't say it enough, but I do so much. I know, and I love you every single day." He kissed her temple. "Thank you for trusting me enough to stay." The seasons continued their cycle. Thomas eventually took on more responsibility with the ranch, allowing Samuel to slow down slightly as he aged. Margaret married a good man from town, a schoolteacher who adored her and appreciated her quiet strength. They built a house close to the ranch, and Margaret visited often with her own children. James, true to his wild nature, became a horse trader, traveling the territory but always returning home eventually. He never married, claiming he hadn't found anyone who could put up with him, but he was devoted to his family and spoiled his nieces and nephews shamelessly. Julia's hair turned fully silver, and Samuel's moved from gray to white. Their bodies grew slower and creaked more, but their love remained constant. They celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren, the ranch house full to bursting with family. "How did we get so lucky?" Samuel asked that night when they were finally alone. "We found each other when we both needed finding," Julia said, "and we chose each other every day after that." When Samuel was 68, his heart began to fail. The doctor said there was nothing to be done, that his heart was simply worn out from a lifetime of hard work. Samuel accepted the news with his usual quiet grace. "I've had a good life," he told Julia. "Better than I ever hoped for, because of you." Julia refused to think about losing him. They'd been together for over 30 years. He was part of her, woven into every aspect of her life. The thought of existing without him was unbearable, but Samuel was practical even about his own death. He made sure Thomas understood everything about running the ranch. He said goodbye to Margaret and James, telling them how proud he was. He held each grandchild and told them stories about their parents as children. And then one warm summer evening, sitting on the porch with Julia beside him, watching the sun set over the mountains he'd loved his whole life, Samuel took his last breath. Julia held his hand, and she felt the moment he left, felt the absence where his presence had always been. The grief nearly destroyed her. For weeks, Julia moved through the house like a ghost, unable to believe Samuel was truly gone. The bed felt impossibly empty. The meals she cooked felt pointless without him to share them. The sunset was beautiful but hollow without his commentary. Thomas and Margaret both wanted her to move in with them, but Julia refused. This house, this ranch, held every memory of her life with Samuel. She couldn't leave it. Slowly, painfully, she learned to live with the grief. She found comfort in her children and grandchildren, in the routines Samuel had loved, in maintaining the home they'd built together. She would sit on the porch in the evenings and talk to him, telling him about her day, about the children, about everything and nothing. "I miss you," she would say to the empty air. "Every moment of every day, but I'm grateful for all of it, for the life we had." Julia lived another 8 years after Samuel's death. She remained sharp and active, helping Thomas with the ranch accounts, teaching her granddaughters to sew and garden, telling stories about the old days to anyone who would listen. She particularly loved telling the story of how she and Samuel met, about standing shaking in the snow, terrified and desperate, and how he'd opened the door and changed everything. "Your grandfather was the best man I ever knew," she would tell the grandchildren. "He saved my life, and then he made that life worth living. That's what real love is. It's choosing each other every single day through everything life brings." One cold January morning, almost exactly 50 years after she'd first arrived at the ranch, Julia didn't wake up. She died peacefully in her sleep, her last moments surely dreams of Samuel and their life together. They buried her next to Samuel on the hill overlooking the ranch, under the big oak tree they'd planted together their first spring. The funeral was large, with family and friends coming from across the territory to pay respects to a woman who'd been beloved by all who knew her. Thomas gave the eulogy, his voice thick with emotion. "My mother arrived in Montana with nothing but the clothes on her back and enough courage to ask for help. My father gave her that help, and together they built not just a ranch but a family, a legacy, a love that sustained them through everything. They showed us what marriage should be, what partnership looks like, what it means to truly cherish another person. We were blessed to be their children, to learn from their example. They're together now, as they always should be. And this ranch, this family, will carry on because of the foundation they built. The Running R Ranch stayed in the family for generations. Thomas's children inherited it, then their children after them. The original house was preserved and maintained, becoming a cherished family landmark. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren grew up hearing the story of Samuel and Julia, of how a desperate woman and a kind man found each other in a Montana winter and built something lasting. On the mantel in the main house, preserved under glass, was the cradle Samuel had made for Thomas, along with Julia's wedding dress and the ring Samuel had given her in the meadow. These artifacts became family treasures, tangible reminders of where they'd all come from. But the true legacy wasn't in objects or property. It was in the values Samuel and Julia had instilled in their children, and that had been passed down through the generations. Kindness to strangers, the importance of honest work, the knowledge that real love is built through daily choices, and that courage sometimes means simply asking for help when you need it. On winter evenings, when snow fell over the Montana mountains and the wind howled around the ranch buildings, family members would sometimes swear they could see 2 figures on the porch of the old house, sitting close together, watching the sunset. Whether it was imagination or something more, the sightings were always considered a blessing, a reminder that some loves are strong enough to transcend even death. The ranch endured through changing times and challenges, through droughts and economic downturns, through wars and social upheavals. But it endured because it was built on a foundation of love and faith, created by 2 people who'd found each other when they both needed finding most. And sometimes, on particularly cold January mornings when the snow fell thick and soft, The family would remember that day over a century ago when Julia Thompson stood shaking on the porch, desperate and terrified, and Samuel Reed opened the door and changed both their lives forever. They would remember his smile and his words, words that had proven prophetic in ways he couldn't have imagined that day. "You're perfect." Because she was perfect for him, and he for her, and together they'd created something that would last far beyond their own lives. They'd built a family, a legacy, and a love story that would be told for generations, inspiring descendants they would never meet to believe in the power of kindness, the importance of second chances, and the miraculous possibility that sometimes, even in our darkest moments, exactly the right person opens exactly the right door. The end of their mortal story was just the beginning of their legacy, and that legacy continued to grow and flourish, carried forward by those who understood that the greatest treasures in life aren't wealth or status but love, family, and the courage to embrace both when they're offered. Samuel and Julia had learned those lessons through experience, through hardship and joy, through every sunrise and sunset of their years together. Their story wasn't just a tale of the Old West or a romance of a bygone era. It was a testament to the enduring truth that love, real love, can transform lives, create families, and build legacies that echo through time. It was proof that sometimes the most important thing we can do is open a door to someone in need and see not their circumstances but their potential, not their past but their future, not their desperation but their strength. And so the Running R Ranch continued, season after season, generation after generation, held together by the bonds Samuel and Julia had forged that winter day in 1884 when two lonely people became two beloved partners, and eventually became the foundation of something far greater than either had imagined possible. Their love had been the seed from which everything else grew, and it remained the heart of the family even after they were gone, living on in the stories, the values, and the enduring truth that sometimes, against all odds, two people find each other at exactly the right moment and create something beautiful that lasts forever.